Hello, I'm Larry Jacobs. I'm a professor at the University of Minnesota in the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. And I want to welcome you to this program today, where we are going to be talking about some big issues and issues that relate to Latino voters and to our upcoming elections. So it's pretty big. I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance that has convened today's program. And we're delighted to have you. I want to thank Mike Curry, who put together today's program, Lee Chittenden, who is our master of the ship, Natalie, who is a kind of really key person in getting the work done for our center. So thanks to all of them. I want to give you an update on programs coming up that we will be showing. Very excited. Tomorrow we've got Al Franken coming in. We are going to have a big conversation. And if you are someone who listens and finds Al Franken insightful, we're getting into the big issues, including the ways in which Democrats might respond to the efforts by Republicans to put another justice on the Supreme Court. If you're someone who's has raised questions or has questions about Democratic campaign this fall, please join us. We're going to get into all those questions, and we'd love to get dueling questions. That's always fun. That is tomorrow. That's noon Central Time. Coming up October 7th, we're going to have a terrific program with Jennifer Lawless, professor at the University of Virginia, and a previous popular guest, and Catherine Pearson, who's a professor here and a colleague of mine at the University of Minnesota, the Political Science Department. And that is going to be on the role of women and gender, which is already shaping the presidential and Senate elections. Very excited to see that program. Delighted to have Tom Friedman joining us again. Many of you know him as a New York Times columnist. He's one of my favorite people to talk about because it doesn't matter where you start, you're going around the world. And already the conversations we've had, I'm very excited about this. It's October 14th at noon, and that's Central Time. We're also going to be having a program on election administration. I know a lot of you have been coming to those because you're concerned about the elections and how they're going to be run. I'll be getting more information about that. One of the things that I want to just really encourage you is to participate in today's conversation. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A button right here. And click on it, give us your questions. We have a bias towards questions that are kind of go against the grain a little bit. Want to move into today's program about Latino voters and Latinos in America. This is a really critical issue. I'm delighted to have Mark Lopez, Dr. Mark Lopez, with us, who's at the Pew Research Center. If you ask me who is the most important public figure grounded in research, Dr. Lopez would be the person. I think you'll see in a minute how compelling he is and the encyclopedic knowledge that he has about Latinos in America and Latino voters. So that's coming up in a second. Today's program is going to be moderated by Professor Michael Minta. He's in the Department of Political Science here at the University of Minnesota. Professor Minta is well known for his study of political representation of African Americans, Latinos, and women, particularly in terms of how they're represented in Congress. His book, Oversight, Representing Black and Latino Interests in Congress, is a terrific book. I highly recommend it. It is with pleasure I turn things over to Professor Minta.
Thanks, Larry. I wanted to just briefly introduce our distinguished guest, Dr. Mark Hugo Lopez. He's the director of the Global Migration and Demography Center at the Pew Research Center. He leads the planning of the center's research agenda on international demographic trends, international migration, U.S. immigration trends, and the U.S. Latino community. Lopez received his doctorate in economics from Princeton University. He's an author of reports about the Hispanic electorate, Hispanic identity, and immigration. The title of his presentation will be, will 2020 be the year of the Latino? So Dr. Lopez, thanks for joining us and welcome.
Great, thank you for the opportunity to do this. And it's a real pleasure to again be here to talk about the nation's Latino population and particularly Latino voters. And I look forward to our conversation and the questions that will come up around this. I want to share a number of data points with you to tell you a little bit of a story about where we are with regards to Latino voters. And I think when you talk about the Latino vote, one of the things that I think is very striking and very important as well is to get a sense of how fast the nation's Hispanic population has grown. And it has grown rapidly over the years. When we talk about the Hispanic population, today that number is estimated to be about 61 million people. But the population grew from about 10 million back in 1970. And this very fast population growth has really been a key driver for US population growth over the last 20 years. In fact, about half of all the nation's population growth has come from Hispanic population growth alone. This, though, has some implications for the electorate. And this year, we project that Latinos, for the first time, will be the single largest group among Blacks, Hispanics, and Asians in terms of an electorate. And that'll be the first time it actually is larger, potentially, than the Black American eligible voter pool. And by eligible voters, I mean people who are at least 18 years of age and a US citizen. Now, this is an important point to make because it speaks to the potential of the Hispanic vote. But it's also important to note that many Hispanics are unable to vote because either they're not a US citizen, so they're undocumented immigrants, for example, or are people who haven't achieved US citizenship yet, but are immigrants nonetheless. Or they're, and this is the biggest part of that story, they're under 18. So when you take a look at the share of the US population that's Hispanic, that's about 18.5%. The share of eligible voters, adult US citizens, for example, who are Hispanic, that share is, we project this year to be at 13.3%. So it's important to keep in mind that even though we've had this fast population growth, it's still only now starting to really reflect itself in the US electorate. One other important point about this, though, is that when we take a look at Hispanics and their turnout, at least through 2016, we've seen a story of where Hispanics haven't quite achieved the potential that their share of the eligible voter pool suggests they might be. So for example, in 2016, fewer than half of Hispanics turned out to vote. That number was 47.6%. By comparison, 65% of whites in 2016 turned out to vote, and those are white and non-Hispanics. Among Black non-Hispanics, that share was about 60%, though notably that share fell sharply from what it had been in 2012. For Asians, that share was 49.3%. But Latinos have traditionally turned out to vote at rates that are below those of other groups, and oftentimes, at least in the last few election cycles, fewer than half of Hispanics have turned out to vote. Now, last year, 2018, the last election, the congressional elections, 2018, were very interesting and also very important because we saw voter turnout rise sharply for Latinos and other groups as well. In fact, about 40% of Hispanics turned out to vote in 2018 at a number, about 11.5 million, that nearly matched what we usually see in a presidential election cycle. It's important to note, though, that other groups as well saw their voter turnout rates rise sharply in 2018. So a couple of things to keep in mind here. Lots of potential for the Latino vote, big numbers in terms of the potential number of voters, but traditionally Hispanic voter turnout rate has lagged that of other groups, and it remains to be seen what will happen this year. Now, we're going into an election cycle where for Latinos, there's a lot of interesting things that are happening around COVID-19, the economy, healthcare, and a number of other issues that are on the minds of generally US voters overall. But with regards to Latinos, one of the striking stories of this year is we entered the year with a near record low unemployment rate for Hispanics. But the COVID-19 recession drove that unemployment rate for Hispanics up to 18.5% in April. That was the highest we've ever seen for Hispanics in the data that we have available from the US government going all the way back to the 1970s. And it was also the highest among any major racial or ethnic group in the United States at the time. Today, that unemployment rate has actually continued to drop. The most recent data from about a week ago from the US government shows that number at 10.5%. So there's been some employment gains among Latinos since April as the US economy has recovered. But in addition to that, we also see that Latinos generally have become pessimistic about the nation's economy. In our June survey, we found that only 18% rated the economy as excellent or good, down from almost half who said the same back in January. But interestingly, Latinos also remain optimistic about the future. We find that 48% in our June survey think the economy will be better a year from now, but that number was only about 35% back in January who said the same. So when you take a look at the nation's Hispanic population and COVID-19, its economic impacts have been quite sharp and have impacted Latinos in a number of ways. We've also found, for example, that Latinos have been impacted on the health side of the COVID-19 outbreak. They're more likely to say they know somebody who has the virus, or they're more likely to say they're worried about giving somebody the virus unknowingly, more so than other Americans. We've also found in a recent survey we did in August that 22% of Latinos tell us they've either had a positive COVID-19 test or were pretty sure that they had COVID-19, even if they didn't get a test. That 22% is higher than what it is for the US public overall, which is only at about 14%. So Latinos are feeling not only an economic impact, but also a healthcare impact when it comes to COVID-19. And that is something that is on their minds going into this particular election. Also, they rate the president and state and local officials somewhat poorly compared to other institutions like hospitals, say, or the CDC, when it comes to the job that they've done with regards to COVID-19. So for example, only 32% of Latinos give Donald Trump an excellent or good job rating when it comes to responding to the coronavirus outbreak. This was as of our August survey of the US public overall. By comparison, 38% of all US adults say the same. And you can see a similar pattern of assessments of different groups by looking at, say, on state elected officials. 46% of Latinos rate them as having an excellent or a good job. By comparison, 86% of Latinos rate hospitals and medical centers in their areas as having done an excellent or good job in responding to the coronavirus outbreak. Also, when we take a look at what Latinos see for the future, at least compared to the US public overall, we find that the majority of Hispanics still say that the worst is still to come with regards to the coronavirus outbreak and the problems that our country is facing. 70% said that back in June, and that was down slightly from April, when 75% said the worst was still to come. But this is significantly higher than it is for US adults. Among all US adults, 59% say that they expect the worst is still to come. So this sense that things are still needing to work themselves out, that there is still some difficult moments to come for the country with regards to the coronavirus outbreak, Latinos are more likely to say that that's the case than the general US public. I want to shift now to the presidential election and talk a little bit about where Latino voters are with regards to this election. And I would say that a lot of these results I'm going to share with you are results that have come from before the news that broke this weekend around the Supreme Court and Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So I think it's important to keep in mind that this is pre all of that. And things, of course, can change quickly in today's environment. But we've done some surveys of Latinos and have looked at their support for the presidential candidates. And we found that in August, Hispanics were supporting Joe Biden over Donald Trump when we asked if the election were held today, who would you vote for? 63% of Latinos said that they either strongly supported Biden or leaned towards Biden, compared with 35% who said the same about Trump. This is different than it is among all registered voters in the United States. Biden is leading among all registered voters, but Latinos are somewhat more likely to support Biden than they are to support the general U.S. public. It's also important to note that this shares that we found 63% support for Biden and 35% support for Trump among Latino registered voters is somewhat below, at least on the Democratic side, where Hillary Clinton was back in 2016, when about 2/3 of Latinos in our surveys pre-election were indicating that they were going to vote for Hillary Clinton in the upcoming election then. But Donald Trump's performance, 35%, is somewhat a little bit higher than what we see for more recent election cycles. For example, in 2016, our survey showed him with about 28% support among Latinos. And that sort of was similar to both John McCain in 2008 and Mitt Romney in 2012. But this 35% that we have here remains below the high water mark of George Bush in 2004, who won about 40 to 44% of the Latino vote, according to exit polls. What are some of the issues that Latinos say are important to their vote this year? Well, they generally tend to be the same issues that the general public is concerned about. So for example, the top 4 issues this year, according to our survey in August, are the economy. 80% of Latino registered voters said that that will be very important to their vote in the 2020 presidential election. Healthcare, 76% cited that as a very important issue to them. The coronavirus outbreak, 72% cited that as an important issue to them. And racial and ethnic inequality, 66% cited that as an important issue, very important issue to their vote in the 2020 presidential election. What's interesting here is that on Supreme Court appointments, we found at the time, and again, this is in August, that 62% of Hispanic registered voters then said that Supreme Court appointments would be very important to their vote in the 2020 presidential election. If you noticed, I haven't mentioned immigration. And immigration is oftentimes seen as perhaps the defining issue for the Latino vote. And while it is important for Latino voters, we've found that the issue of immigration has sort of slipped among the issues list compared to where it was in December of 2019. Back then, when we asked Latinos in an open-ended question, what are the most important issues facing the country? At that time, the economy and immigration were tied for the top issue cited by Latinos, whether registered voters or not, in December of 2019, pre-COVID-19. Now, however, the economy is number 1, followed by healthcare and the coronavirus outbreak, and racial and ethnic inequality. On immigration, about 59% cite that as a very important issue for their vote in the 2020 presidential election. One of the big questions I get about the Latino vote is, well, are they going to play a role in battleground states? And that really raises a question of where Latino eligible voters live. And again, by eligible voters, I mean people who are at least 18 years of age and a US citizen. It's notable to keep in mind that we don't have as detailed information about registered voters as we do about eligible voters, and that's because many states don't collect race and ethnicity in their data collections on registered voters. Nonetheless, where are Latino voters located? Well, about half are in 2 states, California and Texas. If you include Florida, New York, New Jersey, Illinois, Arizona, Colorado, you start to get about almost 3/4 of the Hispanic vote in just those few states. But the story of the Latino vote is not just about the size of it in various states, because some of those states are not necessarily battleground states. California, for example, which has the most Hispanic voters, is the state with that's perhaps not of those that I listed as important with regards to battlegrounds this year. Instead, Florida, oftentimes the perennial battleground, is a state where Latinos make up about 25% of eligible voters. And Arizona, another state which has become a battleground state this year, is a state where Latinos make up about 25% of eligible voters. But if you take a look at those states in terms of both numbers and in terms of both eligible voters, you'll find that, for example, there are 7.9 million eligible Hispanic voters in California, 5.6 million in Texas, 3.1 million in Florida. And when you take a look at it as a share, New Mexico has the highest Latino share among eligible voters at 43%, followed by California and Texas at 30%, Arizona, as I noted earlier, at about 1/4, and Florida at about 20%. Now, that is only part of the story, because the other part of the story is, where has change happened? Where is the Latino vote growing fastest in terms of its share of eligible voters? Well, we see that in the states of California, Nevada, and Florida, where at least the share Hispanic among eligible voters has grown by 9 percentage points or more. Arizona and Texas have seen their share among eligible voters that are Hispanic grow by 8 percentage points between 2000 and today. And if you take a look at a few other states, New Jersey, New Mexico, and Rhode Island are all up 7 percentage points between 2000 and today. Connecticut up 6 percentage points, and Illinois and Massachusetts up 5 percentage points. All states with big Hispanic populations, but also states where Hispanics are a growing share of voters in those states. Notably, there are 2 states which are battlegrounds this year that I haven't mentioned here, which are Georgia and North Carolina. And there, Hispanics make up a growing share of eligible voters as well. In both states, about 5% today, by the way, of eligible voters. But that's only up 3 percentage points from 2000. Now, those states are changing in other ways too. For example, Black eligible voters make up about an additional 5 percentage points in Georgia over this period. So these states have become more diverse in their populations and more diverse in their eligible voter pools. That means Latinos are helping to play a role in perhaps reshaping the battleground map in states like Arizona and Georgia, though they're not the only player. There are many others as well who are playing a part in those roles too. We've also asked Latinos about how they feel about this election. Has the election been an exciting one so far, or has it been dull? And what we found is that among Latino registered voters, 53% say the election so far has been a dull one. Now, this was admittedly as of August, and we have found that Latinos have generally not been as focused on the election as other groups of Americans have been. But notably, Hispanics, about half say that the election so far has been a dull election. One other big question about this election cycle has been whether or not people are going to vote by mail or in some other way. Will they vote in person? And there's been some concern with COVID-19 about how well the nation's election system will run. Well, we've asked registered voters about this, how they plan to vote. And we found that among Hispanic registered voters, 48% say that they expect to vote by mail. Another 28% say they expect to vote in person, and 18% say they expect to vote in person early. Now, that is a little bit different than it is for the general public. For all registered voters, 39% expect to vote by mail, 40% to vote in person on election day, and 18% to vote in person early. So Latinos are somewhat more likely to say that they want to vote by mail than the general registered voter nationally. Now, another question has been, is it going to be easy to vote? Do people think it's going to be easy to cast their vote this year? And according to our August survey, we found that about 44% of Latino registered voters say that they expect voting in the November election to be either very easy or somewhat easy. That's below, though, what you see for all registered voters. Among them, half, 50%, say they expect voting this November to be very easy or somewhat easy. I'm going to stop there because that's a lot of stuff to talk about, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you all might have. There's many things that I haven't discussed here about the Latino vote, including, for example, in the case of Florida, some of the latest polling from other organizations show, for example, that the Latino vote seems to be up for grabs in Florida in a way that wasn't back in 2016. Cuban voters particularly seem to have been leaning towards Trump more so than in 2016, according to many different polls. And there's been a lot of interest in Venezuelan voters in Florida, in addition to Puerto Rican voters. But that's not the only state in the nation that's a battleground where Latinos might be playing a role. And I look forward to talking about those some as I answer some of your questions and hear from you. So, Michael, I think I'm going to stop there.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dr. Lopez. So I have several questions, but since this is at the top of mind of everyone right now with Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death and the president promising to nominate someone by the end of this week. So and the majority leader saying that they're going to hold a confirmation. So one audience member asked the question, President, in that list, Judge Barbara Lagoa is being considered. That's a potential nominee. And so the questioner would like to know what type of impact would it have on the presidential election in terms of the Latino vote?
I think it remains to be seen. I'm not sure how many Latinos are aware of who some of the nominees might be. And even when the nominee is announced, It'll be interesting to see some polling from many different organizations about how aware both the general public is of that person, but also how aware Latinos are. Certainly the appointment of Judge Sonia Sotomayor back in 2009 was something that resonated with many Hispanics. Wasn't an election year, but in some surveys we did around the time, she was oftentimes cited among Latinos as the most important and prominent leader among Latinos, even though she's not an elected leader, and I don't know if she thinks of herself necessarily as a national leader, but the public was seeing her as a leader above everybody else that was mentioned in those surveys.
Yeah, I've read some, we're getting information fast and furious about these nominees, but I didn't realize that she was the legal representative for Elian Gonzalez, his family members in Florida back then, and she's actually a Cuban American. So I think there's some hope that they'll push out the turnout for Cuban Americans in Florida. So we'll see how.
That's a great point. Although Cuban Americans do tend to do turn out to vote in higher rates than other groups of Hispanics nationally.
Yeah, so that'll be great. So Dr. Lopez, I had a question. So the president has made, well, actually when he was then not even a candidate yet, but he made a lot of inflammatory comments about immigrants from Mexico. In 2015, we all know this, he said, when Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're sending people that have lots of problems. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some I assume are good people. But yet in many states, we see that Trump was able to get Latino vote in Florida, in Texas. Can you help explain that paradox? It would seem like it would be going in the opposite direction.
Yeah, when the president, then candidate Trump, made those comments, there was a lot of conversation among Latino leadership and among many news organizations about what this would mean for Hispanics, that Hispanics would be outraged about this, would be very upset about this. Interestingly, as you noted, the election in 2016 showed that Trump was able to win a significant share of the Latino vote nationally, maybe about a quarter to 28%, according to exit polls, and that in Florida, it appeared that he had won the Hispanic vote, at least split it. And that seemed to be something that suggested that perhaps his comments about Mexican immigrants didn't quite resonate with all Latinos. And as you noted, in Texas, he did not necessarily, Trump did not win the Latino vote in Texas, but Texas has traditionally been a state where Republican presidential candidates have tended to do better there than nationally with the Latino vote, even if they don't win the Latino vote. But it speaks to the diversity of this population. Many Hispanics trace their roots to countries other than Mexico. And in some of the work that we have done over the years, particularly focus groups, we found that not all Latinos necessarily find that issues that resonate with, say, on immigration or Mexicans will resonate necessarily with Cubans or Dominicans or Puerto Ricans. And the opposite is true as well. Issues around Cuba don't necessarily resonate with Mexicans, for example, or Mexican origin Hispanics. And even within the Mexican origin population, there are many different points of view. Many years ago, when Arizona was considering its laws around SB 1070 and about unauthorized immigrants in the state, one of the things that we found in our national survey was about 15% of Hispanic adults then were in support of deporting undocumented immigrants if they were in the country illegally. So it's important to note that this is a population that has a wide variety of views, and not all Latinos necessarily I think the same when it comes to issues like immigration, and oftentimes origin of families or they themselves can be an important way in which to see some of these differences in viewpoints among Latinos.
No, that's excellent insight. And so that really raises another, just a follow-up question to that. The Latino population is so diverse, right? And so how do parties, when you talk about the Latino vote, how do parties go and figure out how do you mobilize Latino voters? Like you said, Puerto Ricans, Cuban Americans, Mexican Americans. How do parties even think about strategizing and winning the Latino vote?
That's a great question. I would say this is a question that's not only something that parties have thought about, but also that even marketers have thought about. How do you market to the Latino population because it's so diverse in so many ways? One of the ways that I think you will see this happen, though, is that oftentimes campaigns might have different strategies in different states or even in different parts of states. So, for example, the Republican Party may work to reach out to the Cuban American population in a different way than it does, say, with the Puerto Rican population in Florida, let alone the Mexican American population in a state like Texas. And that's where you see some tailoring of messages from the campaigns to try to reach Latinos in different ways. Sometimes maybe some campaigns do it more than others. It depends on the election cycle, but you do need to think about the Latinos that you're trying to reach in the state. They're not all the same across states, and states sometimes have different issues. So an Arizona Latino may be different than a New York Latino in terms of the issues they're concerned about, let alone their backgrounds and whether or not they even speak Spanish.
Okay. Oh, that's excellent. We go to another question by an audience member. So one of the questioners wants to know about the issues you were talking about with immigration and like how most people, we hear it often, immigration, but obviously from your slides, I mean, in terms of priorities, in terms of this particular election, 2020, we see it was the economy and the economy again, and healthcare and the coronavirus. Is this something that's just a momentary trend, or is this something that's consistent with Latino public opinion? Did immigration just fall immediately and then it goes back up? Or trying to understand, is this just a momentary thing and then will immigration move back up on the list?
Well, I think it's a good point that this may be partly about the moment. That is that the economic impact of the coronavirus outbreak has hit Latino families pretty hard. Another metric that we've been following is whether or not somebody in a Latino's household has either lost a job or taken a wage cut. And we find that over 60% of Latinos live in a household where that's happened, and that's higher than it is for the general U.S. public. So no doubt economic issues are on the minds of Latinos. They were even on the mind of Latinos, by the way, even before the coronavirus outbreak. But what's interesting is that in many years of survey work, we've not found that immigration is the top issue all the time. Yes, it resonates more with Latinos than other groups of Americans, but it was December of 2019 was one of the few times that we found immigration as a top issue among Latinos. That was interesting because for most other elections that we've looked at, it has not been the top issue. Other things like the economy and jobs have oftentimes been rated higher. But some demographics, because I think it's important to keep in mind the population we're talking about here. Nationally, among the 61 million Latinos, about 1/3 are immigrants. And about another 40% are the US-born children of immigrant parents. So immigration is on the minds of many Latinos. I think also it's important to note that the largest single group of undocumented immigrants in the US, about 8 million of the 10.5 million in the country, are from Latin America, with the Mexicans making up about half of that 10.5 million number of undocumented immigrants. So issues like the DREAMer legislation, like Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA, that program, is an example of where Latinos are more likely than the US public to say, yes, this is something that we favor and that we want. They also are more supportive of a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants than other Americans. But when you ask about issues for the election, this year, the economy, healthcare, the coronavirus outbreak response are the top 3 issues that they've cited that are important for their vote this year. Immigration is important, but not necessarily for everybody.
And could you speak a little bit to this about the effect of COVID-19 and the Latino vote? Because it was pretty high up, and I imagine and actually all Americans, it's pretty high up on that priority list. And can you speak some to why that's kind of resonating in terms of any stats or Latinos disproportionately affected by COVID-19? We see the numbers with Blacks, but I wonder if that's the case for Latinos. And do you think they will, do you think the election, their vote will turn on this particular issue?
That's a good question. First, some stats. As I noted in my remarks earlier, we find that 22% of Latinos tell us they've either tested positive for the coronavirus, or they're pretty sure that they had it, and that was a higher share than any other group of Americans. We also find that while Latinos maybe don't have quite the same have not seen the same impact in terms of deaths and in terms of knowing somebody. They're more likely than whites and Asians, for example, to say that they know somebody who has the virus or somebody who's passed away because of the virus. And the economic impact is one that really reflects, particularly in jobs, the jobs that Latinos have. Just like Black Americans, Latinos are concentrated in jobs that have been impacted by the coronavirus. Interestingly, in two ways. On the one hand, hospitality jobs, a lot of Latinos saw their jobs, lost their jobs or were furloughed or laid off because they worked in the hotel industry or in the restaurant industry, industries that saw huge downturns because of the lockdowns that happened across the country or over the course of the spring. On the other hand, though, many Latinos are labeled as essential workers. They work in agriculture, they work in meatpacking plants, but those are also places where we've seen some outbreaks in the coronavirus, in the number of coronavirus cases, and Latinos have been impacted by that as well. On top of all of that, Latinos tend to be in multi-generational households. So oftentimes there's more than 2 or 3 generations living in a household. That means that older Latinos and younger Latinos living together might lead to more transmission of the virus because of the way in which they live. That all has impacts on how Latinos see the coronavirus this year. Will the election turn on this? I think it remains to be seen, because I don't know what other events might happen between now and the election. But certainly this is something that Latinos tell us is important to their vote. But I think these are all tied together. The economy, healthcare, coronavirus outbreak, the top 3 issues that they've cited for this year's presidential election in August, those are all issues that are tied together in some way or another by the coronavirus outbreak.
I have a follow-up question. So what I noticed, racial issues was also on the list, not as high as the other list issues, but they were on the list. And obviously, being here in the Twin Cities and the George Floyd's uprising, and it was on the national attention radar. And so I was just wondering, for you to speculate, because I don't know if you know exactly what's in racial issues, are they thinking about kind of like the George Floyd and the police brutality, racial profiling? Is that calculating? And how do Latinos look at the issues of Black Lives Matter? Could that actually play a role in their decision to cast their vote?
All great questions. I would want to put some perspective on this to our findings for August in terms of top issues with what we found in December. So back then in December, we found in an open-ended question about what are the most important issues facing the country, racial and ethnic injustice was cited by Latinos to make it the 4th most cited issue after the economy, immigration, healthcare, and then racial injustice. Latinos in this presidential, during this presidential administration, during the Trump administration, have told us in a couple of surveys that they've encountered discrimination in their daily lives. They've about 20%, for example, in a 2018 survey told us that they'd been told to speak English because they were speaking Spanish in public, and they were told, in this country you speak English, and so they were kind of called out about that. Also, about 15% or so told us that they'd been told to go back to their home country. And a significant share, about half, told us that they felt that they'd been discriminated against because of their background over the course of the year prior to that survey. To summarize it, we also had a question about whether or not Latinos feel concerned about their place in the country, or do they feel secure in their place in the country? And we found that about half of Latinos, and in fact it's a growing share, say they have serious concerns about their place in the country since Donald Trump's election. So Latinos, even going into the COVID-19 outbreak, were already feeling like the issues around discrimination and the way that the things were impacting their daily lives, that they were concerned about what it meant to be Latino in the US today. The surveys we've done since the COVID-19 outbreak and since George Floyd do show that Latinos are in support of Black Lives Matter, although we have found a notable decline in the share that say that they support Black Lives Matter in the last couple of months. I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but Latinos, just like the general public, have seen a decline in the share who say that they support Black Lives Matter, but it's a majority still that do support Black Lives Matter. But I think that's an important point to note. In addition to all of this, within the Latino population, as a result of George Floyd, there's been a conversation happening around race, because race, of course, is is one other dimension of identity for this population that we call Latinos in the United States. Many Latinos are Afro-Latino, and Afro-Latinos have long pointed to some of the challenges within the Hispanic population around race and talking about race and racial identification. And so we are starting to see, I'm hearing much more about people talking about what it means to have a reckoning around race within the Hispanic population, reflecting some of the conversations from Latin America around race as well.
Okay, oh, that's excellent. Let me go here. So many good questions, really. Let me move this from the issues to more of kind of like the candidates, right, themselves. And so we know that the increase in the Latino population, the increase in the Latino population is largely responsible for the rapid population growth in southwestern states like California and Texas from the numbers that you showed us. But is there any type of movement in some of these in the Midwest? I mean, we live in the Midwest, so do we see anything happening in battleground states such as Minnesota, Wisconsin, or even Michigan?
It's a great question. So the story of Latino population growth is really not just one about the Southwest alone, but it's also one about national growth everywhere. In fact, the fastest growing Hispanic populations are in North Dakota and South Dakota over the last 10 years, reflecting some economic changes there, growth in the energy industry, for example, and people, not just Latinos, but moving there because of jobs. But you do see a growing share of states like Minnesota and Wisconsin among eligible voters. Hispanics make up a growing share. So not large, still under 5%, depending on the state, but a growing share nonetheless in many states around the country. In fact, our analysis of looking at what's happened since 2000 in terms of population change and its impact on eligible voters, every state in the country has seen its Hispanic eligible voter share increase by at least 1 percentage point since 2000.
So do we think, we keep hearing these, demographics is kind of destiny, but obviously we've seen some pushback in states like where you have that rapid Latino population growth. There's the expectation that Texas is going to be a blue state or at least a purple state, and even possibly Georgia. Is there any evidence to kind of back that up in terms of your research?
Well, Latinos nationally, and this has been true for many years now, do lean towards the Democratic Party. Their party identification among registered voters is strongly Democratic and has been so for some time. While their vote for presidential candidates may shift a little bit over the years, Republican candidates, at least since the 80s, have not won the Latino vote at the national level. Now, of course, as we've been talking about, there is a lot of variation across the states. And Latinos aren't necessarily so strongly Democratic in some states compared to others. So Florida being one example, although notably the number of Hispanics registered to vote who say they're Democrats has been growing over the last 10 years. The number who say they identify as Republicans has been growing too, but at a much slower rate in the state of Florida. In the state of Texas, Democratic presidential candidates do win the Latino vote according to exit polls, but the share that they win by is sometimes a little bit lower than what you see at the national level. So there is variation across the states, and Latinos are contributing to some of the broader changes we see nationally in terms of, in some states, in terms of the support for Democratic presidential candidates. But I think it's also important to note that this is a population that isn't necessarily a single voting bloc all the time. And it's one that can change and shift depending on the presidential candidates, depending on other candidates. Latinos, just like other Americans, do sometimes switch their vote from party to party, depending on the candidates who are running. And I think that's an important point to keep in mind.
Well, there's another question. There's so many I want to ask. So that kind of begs the question that one of the audience members brought up is, there's so many Latino voters, yet there's so little representation of Latino candidates. And so, I mean, when there were conversations about the vice presidential person, I can't remember any Latino candidate. I mean, maybe one, but not considered seriously. And so I just wonder if that plays a factor at all in terms of voter turnout for Latino voters.
It's a great question. Well, first, some numbers. So the number of appointed and elected officials at all levels, local, state, and national, has grown. According to NALEO, it's now over 6,000 people who are Latino and at some appointed or elected level nationally. And that is up from about, I want to say 2,000 or 3,000 back in 2000. So over 20 years, we've seen a growth in the number of Latinos who hold public office. That's reflection of the population growth and other changes as well. But I think also the Latino population is still quite young. Its median age is only 30 compared to about 45 for white non-Hispanics by comparison. So I think a lot is to come still in terms of people rising and becoming prominent national figures on the politically. And so we'll see what happens as we move forward into the future. But this has been a question that many people have been asking me over the last 10 years or so, which is, where are Latino leaders? And in fact, we did a survey back in 2013 where we asked Hispanics to identify the nation's most important Latino leader at the time. I had mentioned earlier that Sonia Sotomayor was named by most. She was named by about 10% of Latinos in our survey. But 3/4 told us they couldn't name anybody or didn't know, or said there was no one. So that to me is a very striking finding that yes, there doesn't seem to be these nationally prominent Latino leaders who perhaps might appeal to the Hispanic population at a national level. At the same time though, if you think about the diversity of the Hispanic population, today it's much different in terms of its diversity compared with, say, in the 1960s or 70s. And many people oftentimes point to Cesar Chavez, for example, in the 1960s and 70s, as being that prominent national Latino leader. When are we going to have another Cesar Chavez? I don't know if we will. I don't know if we ever will, simply because this population is a diverse one. And to give you an example, not all Latinos, when we did our survey back in 2013, knew who Marco Rubio was. He was better known among Cubans and Puerto Ricans, but he was less known among Mexicans in the West. And that really, I think, points to the challenge here, to find somebody who could be that leader across all different Latino groups. And we've talked about this diversity, may be a really tough challenge. And so I don't know if we will ever see that one prominent person, but there's a growing number of people who are rising through the ranks and rising through and getting elected to positions across the country that I think eventually we will see more Latino leaders at the national level.
Okay. Yes. Do you think there's an opportunity for, we see that Latinos, obviously a very diverse group, and Republicans have made some headway, but do you see any opportunities or what specific issues could the GOP make a gain greater traction with the Latino vote? And maybe you could kind of break it down by state, because obviously we know there's diversity in Florida and New York, and is there an opportunity?
So I think that one of the potential opportunities is along the issue of abortion. And here, Latinos haven't quite changed in their viewpoints on abortion like the US public has. So over the last 15 years or so, the US public has become more of the view that abortion should be legal in some or all cases. That's different than what we've seen among Latinos, who remain split about whether or not abortion should be legal or not. And that Hispanic number hasn't changed since the mid-2000s. That's notable because on gay marriage, we have seen Latinos shift in their viewpoints. The US public has become more supportive of gay marriage. However, the Latino public, and the Latino public has too, but that's what's so interesting is that this contrast of the US public has moved more towards supporting gay marriage, also more towards abortion should be legal. Latinos have moved more towards supporting gay marriage, but not on abortion like we've seen among the general US public. So that's an interesting contrast, and that is also tied to another important point, which is there are many Latino groups who are very religious, and so religion is very important for some Latinos. About 20% or so are evangelical Christian, and that's a group that has tended to be more Republican than other groups of Latinos. So where are evangelical Christians? Well, interestingly, many who've come from Puerto Rico and moved from the island to the mainland in a state like Florida are evangelical Christian. So the issue of abortion may be more important to them than it is to say Puerto Ricans in New York State. So that's where you might see some opportunity to make gains with the Hispanic electorate. That's why the Supreme Court, what's happening with the Supreme Court and Trump's potential nominee may have some implications for the Latino vote in terms of getting out particularly evangelical Christian Hispanic voters.
So I had a question, and again, it's about the presidential election. Janet Murguia, who's the president and CEO of one of the largest Latino advocacy groups, Unidos USA, once referred to President Barack Obama as the deporter-in-chief for his administration's record on returning immigrants to Mexico. Now, Vice President Biden has linked him. He was the vice president under Barack Obama, and he has linked himself to many of the accomplishments of the Obama administration. So how do Latinos feel about Biden's candidacy, knowing kind of this knock on him by many advocates of the Obama administration?
Yes, it's notable that the Obama administration still, on an annual basis, deported more immigrants than the Trump administration has on an annual basis. So it's also notable that Janet Murguia, who then was the president of the National Council of Raza, and it's become Unidos US more recently, that she had made this comment that Obama was the deporter-in-chief. It's also interesting that after that, in 2012, the Obama administration created the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. And that seems to have been an important driver for getting Latinos to the polls in 2012 and helping Obama win re-election in 2012. So I think there's a little bit of a contrast here. On the one hand, Biden and Obama helped to create something called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals to help dreamers stay in the country legally and work legally, and to value those young people who essentially grew up here, even though they may have come to the country illegally, but are essentially American in every way and have gone to college, got some education, and want to be part of the country. So on the one hand, there's that, and there's strong support for that program. But on the other, yes, we hear echoes about the Democrats and the way the Democrats have done a lot to enforce immigration, particularly during the Obama administration, and that perhaps resonates with some Latinos who have a doubt about the Democratic Party's commitment to the Hispanic population. Now, admittedly, we haven't done any surveys on our end recently to see how Latinos feel about Biden and deportations. That's partly because coronavirus has just been such a big part of the story that's what we have tended to focus on. But it is something that was emerging as a conversation prior to coronavirus, and particularly around issues like DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, and support for that. So
do you think this, I know this isn't a fair question, but I'm gonna ask you anyway. Do you think immigration is going, so let's just say Democrats win the presidency, they win, they hold on to the House, and they somehow get the Senate. Do you think immigration is going to be at the top of the list? Because that's been the criticism of the party, is that they've had opportunities to do it. Obama had a chance, he didn't do it. What do you think? Just speculating.
You know, I don't know. It is interesting what you just said, which is, yes, it's happened before. There was some conversation about in the Obama administration in that first 2 years, there was an expectation that there would have been immigration reform, comprehensive immigration reform is the way people called it back then. I don't know where we're going to go, but it does seem that the Biden campaign has said that if he becomes president, a lot of what President Trump has done around immigration, everything from how many refugees are admitted to the U.S. To asylum seekers, to also things like temporary protected status and deferred action for childhood arrivals. I know it's a lot of programs. Sorry, I'm throwing all those names at you. No, but those are all policies that the Trump administration has worked to either pull back, like refugee admissions, or to potentially eliminate, but have been stopped in the courts. So the Biden campaign has said that they would reverse a lot of those. Now, it's not just about Latinos, because immigration affects a lot of people, and H-1B visas is another one of the areas where the Biden campaign has said that they would do some reversals on what the Trump administration has done. But we'll just have to see what happens. I think some of this might happen on executive orders if Biden does become president. Whether or not there's legislation, I think that will be something that remains to be seen.
And we've talked a lot about the presidential race, but I want to go back to maybe some races that you're watching, like where Latinos could make the difference between the winner and the loser. I mean, the U.S. Senate. Do you see any races where Latinos can be the decisive margin of victory for either the Republicans or the Democrats?
It's a good question. Arizona is one that comes to mind, and thinking about the role of Latinos there. Other ones that come to mind, frankly, on the presidential side, I'm always focused on Florida because there's always so many questions about Florida and what Florida might mean. But nationally, I'm also interested in what happens in the presidential race in Nevada. So we'll see how Nevada goes as well, and what role Latinos play.
So if Nevada is that would be really good. And then Colorado, I mean, obviously that's a tough state, and there's a contentious, Cory Gardner, the Republican, gets Hickenlooper, and so that's going to be. Do you think Latinos are they continuing to grow in Colorado? I think they are, but I don't know.
They are, but Colorado is a state that has a long established Hispanic population, much like New Mexico does, and Arizona and Texas do. And it tends to be a population that isn't necessarily to the same degree leaning towards the Democratic Party as, say, you see in a place like California, though the majority do lean towards the Democratic Party. So I don't know. I have to admit that I haven't looked closely at Colorado, but you're right. That's a place where Latinos could potentially play a role, not only at the presidential level, but also at the Senate level.
Well, and I want to get back to Arizona because, Mark Kelly, I mean, this could be historic. I mean, it's been a long time, if any, where there could be two U.S. Democratic senators. And so if Mark Kelly beats McSally, he would join Sinema. And so they would be two Democrats. So is this a long-term trend? Is Latinos turning Arizona? Will it be a lot like California and a lot of these southwestern states where it's a blue state at the presidential level?
It's a great question. It could be, but we've talked a lot about demography being destiny, and I am not sure. One needs to be cautious because the Latino vote over the last 20 years has been one that has fluctuated in its support for Republicans and Democrats across the country, whether at the state level or at the national level. Yes, California has become a state where Latinos are very much in support Democratic candidates. That's perhaps one example of where things might go. But Florida could be another example. And who knows what Arizona will become. Hispanics in Arizona have traditionally been a little bit more conservative and Republican leaning than, say, in California. So just because there's been growth in the Hispanic population doesn't necessarily mean it's always going to be a California story in the future.
Okay, so we need to be careful not to read too much into these Arizona results right now.
Yes, I do think it'll be interesting and fascinating to see what happens. And yes, no doubt the Latinos are helping to shape Arizona. But Arizona, keep in mind, is a state that's grown in population because Californians have moved there who are not Hispanic, and other people from around the country have moved there. So Hispanics are part of the population growth story there, but they're not the only story. There are many other stories. Same thing with Texas. We talk about Texas turning blue because of Latinos, but Texas has been a destination for non-Latinos too over the last 10 years because its economy has been doing quite well compared to other states. So people have moved to Texas, and they've come from California, for example, and have brought their politics with them. So I think the story of these states is not so starkly because of Latinos, but Latinos are contributing to some of the change.
Okay, great. All right, thank you. I enjoyed the presentation. So we want to thank Dr. Lopez. I think we're out of time. So we want to thank Dr. Lopez for this wonderful discussion. Also the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance for hosting. And we want to thank the audience for tuning in. And as Professor Jacobs mentioned, please tune in tomorrow at noon for a conversation with former Senator Al Franken. So thank you very much.
Thank you.